Good evening. Good evening and welcome to Let's Talk Loyalism's online live panel discussion on the Northern Ireland Protocol called Problems with the Protocol. It is the first of two events that Let's Talk Loyalism is hosting. The first event is taking place right now, of course, called Problems with the Protocol, and the second event will take place on Monday, the 14th of June at 7 p.m. called Alternatives to the Protocol. So if you're interested in hearing a conversation about protocol alternatives, you'll hear some tonight. But if that's what you want to hear about, then stick that in your diary as well. But it's all about tonight, folks. So thank you for joining us this evening, whether you're tuning in on Let's Talk Loyalism's Facebook page, on our Twitter account, or on our YouTube channel. You are very much welcome indeed. And we hope tonight, our aim for tonight, is for it to be an informative discussion, so people can learn a little bit about what the Northern Ireland Protocol is, but also, in particular, how catastrophic it is, not just for unionism, but also for every citizen in Northern Ireland. So without further ado, I think it's about time I introduce our panel members this evening. I am Moore Holmes. I am a member of Let's Talk Loyalism and I will be moderating the discussion tonight. But our panel members who will be fielding our questions this evening and taking part in the discussion are, first up, we have the leader of the traditional unionist voice and North Antrim MLA, Jim Allister QC. Great to have you on, Jim, and welcome. How are you?
I'm good. Good to be with you.
Second, we have former Vauxhall MP and former Minister for Sport and Civil Society, who now serves in the House of Lords, Baroness Kate Hoey. Thanks for attending, Kate. How are you tonight?
Pleasure. Lovely. Nice to be with you all.
Brilliant. And third, our third and final panelist is an outspoken critic of the Northern Ireland Protocol, Unionist voice editor and author of the book Brexit Betrayed, Loyalist Jamie Bryson. Good to see you, Jamie. How are you?
Hi, Moore. How are you? Nice to be with you.
Good. Brilliant. So, for those who are listening, the format for this evening is I'm going to field a series of questions to our panel members and let them discuss it out, let them have a bit of dialogue on the key issues around the Northern Ireland Protocol. And then towards the end of the evening, we will be selecting some questions posted from the public on social media and posing them to our panel members. Okay, so first things first, Kate, let's ask you, for those who maybe don't know exactly what the protocol is, maybe they only know it as the Irish Sea border. What actually is it? How did it come about? Why is it so controversial?
Right. Well, I mean, it all goes back to the United Kingdom back in November 2016, voting to leave the European Union. And if those of you who did vote, you will have gone in and seen your ballot paper, which asked you to vote for whether the United Kingdom wanted to leave the EU or not. And I was a great campaigner to leave the EU, and I still would campaign to leave the EU. And I say very strongly to everyone who goes on about the protocols all about Brexit because of Brexit. We didn't get Brexit in Northern Ireland, and we had instead, we've had a kind of half-cocked, if I can put it like that, Brexit. Now, the genesis really of the actual protocol was started way back in 2017 after we'd voted to leave, when Theresa May was Prime Minister, and there was a joint UK-EU report even then, which was absolutely based on trying to ensure that there would be no north-south border on the island of Ireland, that would be free of infrastructure. And the joint report, which was agreed by Theresa May's negotiating team, led to her withdrawal agreement of 2018, which she tried very much to put through the Commons, and that had what was called the backstop. And I do get a little tired of people saying, when I listen to some of the discussion in Northern Ireland, oh, well, if only we'd had the backstop. Well, of course, the backstop would have left the whole of the United Kingdom in the customs union and the single market. And that was not something that those of us who campaigned to have Brexit and for us to become a truly independent country wanted to see happen. So the withdrawal, her withdrawal agreement kept being defeated. And then eventually when she left and Boris Johnson became Prime Minister and there was a general election, and Boris Johnson won that election on the basis of getting Brexit done. And there was the revised withdrawal agreement, which replaced the backstop with the Northern Ireland Protocol, because that left the rest of the United Kingdom very much out of the single market and the customs union, but left Northern Ireland in this kind of halfway house. And the protocol, of course, for me, fundamentally, and I don't want to get into this now, is a constitutional issue, because it's changed everything about Northern Ireland. But also, hugely importantly, it has affected day-to-day business, as we know, in Northern Ireland. And I think the one thing I would say right at the beginning, everyone in Northern Ireland, I suppose, unless you were a complete and utter, using an expression, a rabid Republican, everyone in Northern Ireland should be opposed to the protocol. It doesn't distinguish between whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant. It is actually bad for people in Northern Ireland generally, and it can only get worse, because as the rest of Great Britain gets further and further away from the way the European Union works, because that was what they wanted to do when we voted to leave, then Northern Ireland will be left behind under the aegis of the European Union. So the protocol is a ridiculous name. It's very detailed pages to read. Most people who speak about it have not read it, just like most people who speak about the Belfast Agreement haven't read it. And we're in a situation now where, and we'll get on to discuss this, I'm sure, where I think most people in Northern Ireland, even some of them might not want to admit it, but most people think that it should not be there. And what we want to see is a way of making sure that we can get rid of the protocol and ensure that all the way that the trade goes on can carry on as normal, accepting that obviously the Republic of Ireland is still in the European Union. They want to protect their internal market. And as far as I'm concerned, then they should be able to do that, but within their own territory. So I think I'll leave it there and let Jamie and Jim add anything to that. But I mean, that's my idea of how we got here. But it's very much down to us leaving the European Union, but Northern Ireland did not leave the European Union in the same way as the rest of the United Kingdom.
I would just quickly add to that, Kate, and I think that's an excellent and substantive summary. But if we were to sum the protocol up in a paragraph, it's a device which subjugates Northern Ireland within an economic united Ireland and partitions the United Kingdom, putting the border down the Irish Sea, which is fundamentally a constitutional abomination. And it actually came about, and we'll touch on all of these issues later, I'm sure, but it came about as a reward for nationalist threats of violence. So if you want to know what it is in a paragraph, it is the mechanism and the weapon that is pointed towards the destruction of the United Kingdom as we know it, by partitioning our own country in a way to reward those who would otherwise threaten the peace process.
Yeah, I think it's quite clear that the protocol leaves Northern Ireland, unlike the rest of the United Kingdom, effectively annexed into the EU. It leaves us subject to many of their laws and regulations, which of course we have no input into, do not make ourselves, cannot change. So it does indeed subjugate us into a foreign power, and therein is the greatest constitutional objection and threat from the protocol, and we'll talk about that. And the purpose of the protocol, of course, from the EU side, was to punish the United Kingdom for daring to leave the EU. And they devised the protocol as a device to make Northern Ireland the price of Brexit. And as Kate so aptly said, we didn't get Brexit. We got the protocol, the very opposite of Brexit, because we do not now in all areas make our own laws. We are now subject to the laws of others, and that strangles our economy. And we'll talk shortly, I'm sure, about that.
Yeah, and if I could I just add one thing? I'm sure most of the viewers and listeners will have heard of the European Research Group, which was the group within the Conservative Party who was very strongly leave. They maintain that they knew, of course, that it wasn't satisfactory, but they wanted to get Brexit done. And they were absolutely convinced that the political declaration as part of the protocol actually could be superseded in the future, that it should not necessarily be a permanent. It was envisaged that the Northern Ireland Protocol would not automatically become a permanent arrangement. And indeed, they say they say anyway, that they told the Prime Minister that this was unfinished business.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting hearing that, and that's a fantastic summary from each of you there. And particularly, Kate, when you talk about how the genesis of this issue goes back to 2016 and failure to deal with or implement the referendum result in a satisfactory fashion. Because the protocol for so many people was portrayed as not a problem, in fact, but a solution to the issues in Northern Ireland and all the rest of it. So the purpose of this evening and why this is so valuable is to highlight that actually this isn't the solution at all. This has exacerbated or worsened the problems that we face. So, and a number of things were touched on there by each of you. And I suppose the first thing that I want to focus on is the fact that it is an economic arrangement with constitutional implications and all the rest of it. And I want to focus on, first and foremost, that economic nature or the economic consequences, because it is part of a trade agreement between the UK and the European Union, and it has an impact on our economy. So, Jim, just to ask you, is it good? Is the protocol good for our economy? Because there'll be people out there who maybe don't share the same unionist values that you or I would, and they're able to swallow the constitutional outrage that it may be. But in terms of having economic opportunities with the protocol, it's often described as the best of both worlds. Is it?
I think it's the worst of both worlds, because until the protocol came along, we were an integrated part of the fifth biggest economy in the world, namely that of the United Kingdom. Our trade flowed freely to and from GB, and GB, of course, is our biggest market. It's where most of our supplies come from, and because of the protocol, those supply chains are now grossly interrupted by regulatory checks and, after the grace periods, by tariffs, because the protocol works on the premise that any goods coming into Northern Ireland are at risk of travelling on into the EU's single market in the Republic. And that is the presumption that is what will happen. And therefore, because we're subject to the EU's customs code, that applies tariffs to every good that moves in that direction. Now, if the goods don't ultimately move to the Republic, the trader can reclaim the tariff that he's already paid. So that is a stifling of economic activity. And along with that, there goes huge bureaucratic paperwork, which is so burdensome, because the EU is the ultimate bureaucracy machine. It is so burdensome that we've got to the point where many suppliers in GB, be it plants, be it seeds for our agriculture industry or other things, are saying, we can't be bothered with this. We're just going to stop supplying Northern Ireland, and therefore our economy is going to suffer further. And once you cut a part of a nation off from the blood supply that is its economy with the rest of trading in the United Kingdom, then you do untold damage to that economy. Now, of course, the purpose in doing that is an obvious political purpose. It is to force Northern Ireland business, to force the Northern Ireland economy to realign away from London towards Dublin, so that economically we look constantly and increasingly to the Irish Republic and the EU single market for our trade, and diminish our reliance upon GB. Anyone with a brain in their head and any political awareness will know that that is a political motivation. And the political motivation is to create the all-island economy. And the purpose of the all-island economy is ultimately to create an all-Ireland, because it is a relatively short step from economic union to political union. Look at the EU itself as a template to prove that. When the EU started, it was described as a common market. Then along came Maastricht and the Nice Treaty and all the rest, and it built this single market. But the original purpose of the EU was always clear. It was there in the very first treaty, and the very first treaty encapsulated as obtaining ever closer union. How did they propose to create ever closer union? By creating ever closer economic union. That's the EU template. It's the same template that's been applied to the protocol. And the template is create economic union on the island of Ireland, and political union will follow. And that will lead us on to our discussion later, I'm sure, about the constitutional position. So you cannot say to a country, we're going to cut you off from your main market. We're going to put a border between you and them. We're going to put checks. We're going to put tariffs. But you're getting the best of both worlds. What nonsense. We are now strangled by our dependency. Most of what you see in your supermarket shelves come from GB. And now all those goods are subject to checks and restraints. And much that comes to our agri-food industry, the compounds for our feedstuffs, our fertilizer, comes from GB. Now, all of that is to be hampered and restricted and made more expensive, because ultimately it is the consumer who will pay. So there is no good protocol in any sense. I've heard some nonsense talked about, think of the attraction of bringing a company to set up in Northern Ireland because they can sell to both GB and the EU. What they don't tell you is, bring that company to Northern Ireland, and if they need their supplies from the GB market, they'll be nigh impossible to get without paying huge prices, because we have put a border and restrictions. So there is no good protocol. It is economically disastrous for Northern Ireland, and it inevitably is so because of our close economic ties and dependency upon the trade which exists, which made the United Kingdom.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that. You mentioned that there is a sort of idea or narrative out there that, this best of both worlds or whatever it may be. Because I did notice Simon Hoare, the MP who sits on the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, was in dialogue, I think it was with yourself, Jamie, over Twitter, and he was talking about how his businesses in his constituency, their eyes would be green with envy, as if they would maybe want the opportunities, and that's how it's being talked about. Like, this is an opportunity. But based on what Jim's saying there, it's certainly not. Would you concur, Jimmy?
Yeah, look, I would adopt Jim's submissions. Wholesale. There's not a great deal to be gained from me repeating them, but on the discussion with the purported chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, Mr. Hoare, I mean, he doesn't think that this is a constitutional issue, and I know we're going to come on to that next, but I think, as Jim touched on quite simply and concisely, there is but a small step from economic union to political union, and of course the political motivation in all of this, probably like the entire peace process over the last 23 years, is to take another step within the only trajectory of the peace process, which is towards an All Ireland. And I mean, look, just to summarise that point very, very quickly, when we talk about the process, a process by its very definition has a beginning and an end. And if you want to know where the end of the process is, simply take a look at the Northern Ireland Act and look at the only legal end envisaged, which is a referendum on United Ireland, and a continuous one potentially every 7 years until the answer is yes. So all of this comes within that broader context of the last 23 years. So Jim's quite right in all of the economic points that he makes, but I mean, fundamentally, this is a stepping stone from economic union to political union, and that's why it's such a contemptible constitutional issue, which and I'm amazed that the chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee can't see that, either willingly or for whatever other reason he doesn't appear to see it. But for a member of the Conservative and Unionist Party not to understand that most basic premise, then I think that's very disappointing indeed.
Yes, and just before we get on to the constitutional issues, and I definitely want to talk about that, and I'm going to give each member time to discuss that. When we're talking about the economic implications, there's also medical implications. I mean, we've heard it talked about how the protocol is bad for your health. Sam McBride in the newsletter published an article, a report about how there's potential for cancer treatment, cancer medicine, support for cancer patients, and medical goods or equipment or whatever it may be, struggling to get here to the same speed in Northern Ireland than it is dispensed throughout Great Britain.
Yeah, well,
So
let's understand
Yeah, I
what
mean-
that is. That's because under the protocol, and this part has been delayed till next January, Northern Ireland ceases to have its medicine supplies
Yeah.
controlled by our own UK regulator, and it becomes controlled by the EU Medicines Agency. So any regular supply of medicine needs to be a medicine approved by the EU Medicines Agency. And we've had examples where drugs are more quickly approved in the UK than they are in the EU. Indeed, one of the vaccines for the COVID was approved 6-7 weeks earlier in the UK. So once that aspect of the protocol kicks in entirely, we would be left like the Republic of Ireland, waiting for approval of vaccines, waiting for approval of cancer drugs, unable to get them until the EU goes through all its burdensome bureaucracy. Whereas within the United Kingdom, we have a fast track process which can produce results and therefore afford to us the same facilities as the rest of the United Kingdom. But that will end on medicine.
Yeah.
It's absolutely preposterous
Yeah.
that as citizens of the United Kingdom, we're going to be denied medicines available to the rest of the United Kingdom.
And
You see,
Kate, do you want to come in on that?
Well, I mean, the medicines thing, I think, is something that
That's what they're looking for.
we've seen one example of it already, and we'll see more. And we saw, of course, the benefit of not being in the European Union over the recent vaccination and how much better we did on that. But the grace periods are only temporary, and I mean that's what people need to realise, that if they think things are bad at the moment, they're going to get a lot worse when these grace periods end. And we saw that even when the UK government actually imposed a longer grace period, the EU turned around and said, we're going to take you to court. I mean, the EU has consistently failed to engage even with the UK on alternatives and on flexibility. And I think that kind of shows that, some people sort of said, oh, well, the EU really cares about Northern Ireland and that's why they're doing this. They don't want to have a hard border and all this. And no one ever defines a hard border. But anyway, they have actually shown no real interest in Northern Ireland, because otherwise they would have gone along with some of the ideas that would have made the protocol actually not needed, the kind of mutual recognition of the fact that we've just left the EU. All our standards are at the moment exactly the same as the European Union. So all this stuff about psychosanitary border stuff and all the exercise to do with seeds coming in, pets. I mean, the pets issue is a huge issue for just people who not interested in the constitutional issue at all, don't really feel that that's something that they need to be concerned about, although I think they should. But the pets issue is something that really affects them, isn't it? I mean, if you can't go over and visit family in England and then bring your dog back without having to get rabies and injection and all of these things that are going to add to the cost and the bureaucracy. And that's where the EU is really showing that they genuinely don't seem to care in the slightest about Northern Ireland, that actually their whole aim was, either to punish the United Kingdom for daring to leave their great club, or, to break up the United Kingdom as a whole.
Okay. Well, thank you. So, like has already been mentioned, there is an economic problem with the Northern Ireland Protocol, and you were talking about, or you hinted towards the constitutional issues with the protocol. So let's talk about that. How does this affect, Jamie, we'll start with you. How does this affect the constitutional position of Northern Ireland? We've heard things about the Act of Union 1800, the Belfast Agreement, the question of sovereignty. What constitutional problems does the protocol pose Northern Ireland, Jamie?
Well, I think it's important to break this down into its constituent parts. So, I mean, if we start from the very basic premise of what is the Union, and while the Union is fundamentally, in a legal sense, the Act of Union, I mean, it is the very definition of a constitutional statute. So the first problem that arises in relation to the protocol is that in making the treaty with the European Union, the British government exercised what's called the Crown prerogative. Now, it's a very basic and proposition of law that one cannot use a prerogative in a manner which conflicts with statute and conflicts with domestic law. Now, plainly, there's been a breach of Article 6 of the Act of Union, which is meant to ensure that all citizens of the United Kingdom are on an equal footing in terms of treaties and in terms of trade and matters such as that. So therefore, in the exercise of the Crown prerogative, that is was unlawful, because plainly it interferes with a domestic statute, primary legislation in the form of the Act of Union. So that's one constituent part of the legal problem with it. The second problem with it is that in Section 7A of the Withdrawal Act 2018, what it purports to do by use of very general and ambiguous words is to essentially repeal by implication, according to the government, the article, well, certainly parts of Article 6 of the Act of Union. And again, it's a very basic constitutional law point that, firstly, general words can't override the specific, which is purported to have happened in this case. And secondly, if you're going to interfere with either fundamental rights or a constitutional statute, which the Act of Union clearly is, then Parliament has to accept the political consequences of that. They have to do that expressly and clearly, and reliance upon general or ambiguous words will not suffice. And I mean, Parliament had the opportunity to expressly repeal the Act of Union if they wanted to do so, and Parliament did not do that. So Section 7A of the Withdrawal Act has to give way to the Act of Union, which means that the imposition of the protocol is unlawful. And just finally, one point, I mean, just as a little bit of support for the proposition that the Crown prerogative can't be used to override statute in the form of domestic law. I mean, it's set out very clearly in a very famous case of Miller in 2017, the first Gina Miller case, and go to paragraph 55, and it's very clear the Crown prerogative can't be used in the manner in which it has been used in this. So all of this, whenever you take this together, and I'm going to tie this very briefly to the Belfast Agreement, is that the Belfast Agreement, and I don't support it, I entirely oppose it, I think it's always been a deceptive snare, but let's take it at its height for those who do support it. It's always been sold to Unionism that there are protections for the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, and that's within Section 1, subsection 1 of the Northern Ireland Act. That's how the political deal, if you were, the Belfast Agreement translates into domestic law. But if, in this instance, so if we take the government's case and at its height, what they say is that number one, the Withdrawal Act has repealed the Act of Union. And number two, and this is very clear, Northern Ireland are subject to foreign laws and under the jurisdiction of a foreign court. Now, if we just follow the logic of that through, if Northern Ireland, without the consent of the people or offending the protections within Section 1, subsection 1 of the 1998 Act, can be made subject to the jurisdiction of foreign lawmakers and foreign courts, then what would stop Northern Ireland being made subject, without the protections of Section 1, subsection 1 being offended, to the jurisdiction of Dublin courts, or to lawmaking from Dublin, or to joint authority? And the answer to that is, if the protections do not prevent it happening to the EU, then plainly it wouldn't prevent it happening with Dublin. So the very fundamental question is, and if I summarise this in a paragraph, does Section 1...
We're losing Jimmy a wee bit.
I'm sure Jim can carry on that bit.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, I'm happy to talk.
We've just lost Jimmy there. Jim, if I would just turn to you until we get Jimmy back. Jimmy was mentioning a couple of points around the Act of Union, right? And how you cannot repeal the Act of Union. It's such a fundamental law or a constitutional statute which is integral to the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, or Ireland at that time being a part of it. You cannot, am I right in interpreting that correctly? You cannot sneak a law in through the back door. You have to openly and unequivocally repeal it if you're going to do that.
Yes, that's fundamentally right. Now, let's be very clear. Something very shocking happened during the hearing of the judicial review a couple of weeks ago. The government initially sought to argue that there was no breach of Article 6 of the Act of Union, which is the article which guarantees unfettered trade between and within all parts of the United Kingdom, because they sought to argue there was no border in the Irish Sea. But very quickly, as any child could tell you, that became untenable. So the government then, and this is the shocking thing, reverted to an argument, well, that didn't matter that Article 6 had been breached because there had been repeal of Article 6 impliedly by the passing of the Withdrawal Act. Now, the legal position is that in regular ordinary legislation, if there is a conflict between two acts of Parliament, the latest one prevails on the principle that it's interpreted as having repealed the first. But there is a very clear principle of difference in respect of constitutional provisions. And any legislation, and there's all sorts of dicta by Lord Hope and others, any legislation which is decreed to be constitutional in nature can only be repealed expressly. That's to say, the succeeding act that purports to say it needs to put it front and center and say, we are repealing, in this case, Article 6. The Withdrawal Act doesn't mention the Act of Union. Yet the government sought to argue that by implication it had been repealed. Now, that's a staggering thing for a Conservative and Unionist government to say, that they secretly have repealed a foundation stone of the Act of Union.
And Jim, what would you make of people who say, well, the Act of Union, 1800 or 1801, it was forming the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and they look at the Act of Union and say, well, that was Great Britain and Ireland. Ireland is no longer what it was. There's now two jurisdictions there, and they therefore look at the Act of Union like, from that point on, at least, it was null and void. What would you say to that sort of counterclaim?
I would say it's absolute nonsense. The Act of Union was that which brought in the union then of all of Ireland and Great Britain. The fact that the Republic of Ireland opted later to leave that union left those who remained intact within that union, and therefore Article 6 still prevails. Now, what the protocol does is it takes Northern Ireland in terms of many of its economic issues, and it constructs a situation where we no longer can enjoy the unfettered trade promised by the Act of Union. And worse than that, it means because we're in a foreign single market for goods, subject to a foreign customs code, subject to a foreign VAT regime, that all the laws that govern those things are made in a foreign jurisdiction, overseen by a foreign court. And all of that without any consent from the people of Northern Ireland. So what you have in the protocol is, in respect of all the matters that fall under the single market and everything that goes with it, all the laws that govern that are now laws which we didn't make, cannot change, and which apply in perpetuity to us. And those are laws which touch every tentacle of our economy. So you're in a situation where fundamentally the most democratic principle of all in modern democracies, that namely people are governed by the laws that they and their own representatives make, has been abrogated. It has been swept away under the protocol. And those who call for rigorous implementation of the protocol, I just can't take in that someone in the Alliance Party, for example, that says they believe in democracy, think that there should be rigorous implementation of laws we didn't make, can't change, and have no say in. And they want to surrender control of that to foreign jurisdictions. That is so antithetical to basic democratic principles that it's something that no Democrat should ever embrace. And yet the rigorous implementers, that is what they're trying to put upon us. So the constitutional implications of the protocol are immense. The protocol is dismantling the union before our very eyes in the manner in which I have described. And it is doing it without any consent. And consent is supposed to be the main building block of the institutions in Northern Ireland.
And Jim,
Kate,
would
do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Jim would probably also agree that, first of all, that this will probably end up in the Supreme Court for them to make a decision on this hugely, hugely important change, but also that there's, tie-ins and links to Scotland and their attitude to this. So, this is really something that has come up as a result of our judicial review that got very little coverage in Northern Ireland and very little coverage. It hasn't yet been really taken on by the legal professions and particularly law lords and so on. And I think this is going to be something that is just so big and so important that I think the government will really, really regret the way they brought this in at the last minute as part of their defence. But did you want me to say something about the Belfast Agreement being broken?
We'll go on to that. We'll go on to that in a wee moment, if that's all right. I just want to give Jamie an opportunity to finish what he was saying there previously before you got cut off, Jamie.
Yes, sorry about that. My Wi-Fi connection went. Look, I'm not sure how much you got at the end of it, but I think Jim's contribution and latterly Kate's, there's an extraordinary issue here, which has not been addressed by the mainstream media in Northern Ireland and has not got the political attention it deserves. And it is this: if the protections within Section 1, subsection 1 of the Northern Ireland Act does not protect against a substantive change to the status of Northern Ireland so great as lawmaking power being handed over to a foreign jurisdiction, foreign laws made, taxation without representation, as it were, and the jurisdiction of foreign courts. If it does not protect against that, then it doesn't protect against joint authority. I mean, that's a basic logic of all of that. And secondly, if the protections within Section 1, subsection 1 of the 98 Act doesn't prevent against a repeal of the Act of Union, then I mean, what protections does the Belfast Agreement and the Northern Ireland Act actually provide to the Unionist community in practice? And there's a very fundamental question here, and the courts can't get away from this, and the government can't get away from this, and the Irish government can't get away from this. And this is the very, very simple, and this is the Belfast Agreement, and constructive ambiguity is now running out of space, and the fundamental question has to be answered. Does protecting the union and the protections for the unions mean protecting the substance of the union, or does it merely mean protecting the symbolism of the union insofar as it only protects, to use a phrase adopted by John Larkin QC, it only protects against the last line of the Union flag from Hillsborough Castle? And that is a fundamental question that the Unionist and Loyalist community of Northern Ireland and our political representatives must get an answer to, because if it turns out to be the case that Northern Ireland can be handed over to a foreign power, to a foreign parliament, essentially to make laws on our commission to make laws on our behalf, and the Act of Union can be repealed, and there's no protections in that for consent within the Belfast Agreement, then what does the Belfast Agreement actually give to the Unionist and Loyalist community? So the protocol's done anything, it's flushed that issue. And just finally, I mean, I caught the tail end of Jim. I'm not sure whether he agreed or disagreed with some of the legal points, but I think it's two very, very basic premises of constitutional law, in that you, number one, the Crown prerogative can't be used in the manner it's been used because it conflicts the Act of Union, and secondly, Section 7A of the 2018 Act, the general words in that can't, by implication or any other way, repeal the express words in the Act of Union. And if Parliament want to repeal the Act of Union, then Parliament take responsibility for that and do that and clear words, and Parliament haven't done that. So I think that's not only a legal problem, but that's a political problem for Parliament, because I would love to see any Conservative and Unionist Prime Minister going before Parliament and saying he wants to repeal the Act of Union.
And of course that's very significant in terms of the debate going on about the future of the Union with Scotland.
Yeah.
Because if the Act of Union can be secretly repealed in a key component, as here, then I would have thought Unionists in Scotland and Conservative and Unionists in Scotland should be very alarmed about how they could be double-crossed in respect of this. So it is a union-wide ramifications and it is the most single issue. You know, the protocol is bad economically, it's disastrous, it is crippling our economy. But I have to tell you, the far more significant, long-lasting issue is the constitutional issue. It is pushing us onto the window ledge of the union with a view to pushing us right off it as it unfolds. So it is dismantling the union, and it's dismantling the union quite obviously by contradicting, and the government says repealing, a fundamental of the act that is the union. And therefore it's something that no unionist can afford to be equivocal about. And indeed, I hear many unionist politicians talk about the economics, which is right, but they also need to be very mindful of the constitutional implications of the protocol.
That's right.
Because ultimately they're far, far greater.
That's right. I mean, it is interesting to hear all the different takes and all the different problems, including the economic ones, which are very important, but also that this is not just a threat to unionism, a threat to every citizen in Northern Ireland, but actually a threat to democracy itself. I want to move on to the Belfast Agreement, and I know we've been talking about it in some depth there as well. But we heard the Belfast Agreement has been front and centre throughout the Brexit discussions and throughout the protocol, the creation of the protocol, and the protocol was almost pitched as a protection of the Belfast Agreement, or at least, you know, that was the purpose of it, which, you listening to some of the comments, you know, seems a bit like lunacy. But time and time again, it was talked about how we needed to protect the Belfast Agreement, how it could not be brought into disrepute, and new vocabulary was made about, you know, protecting the spirit of the Belfast Agreement and all the rest of it. Kate, does the protocol do that? You want to maybe elaborate on that? In what ways is it inconsistent with the Belfast Agreement, or how do you think the Belfast Agreement has been used throughout this process?
Yeah, well, Jamie sort of mentioned a little bit already about the Belfast Agreement. And by the way, it's interesting, you know, I don't know why everyone keeps talking about the peace process, because the Belfast Agreement was actually called the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement. And, you know, I'm never sure where the word process came. And I think it was Jamie or Jim earlier said it's quite right. You know, there is only a process is a never ending. And the only thing that, you know, is in the agreement that can actually end up in this process is this referendum for a united Ireland. So I think we've got to stop talking about it being a process. But anyway, as far as the Belfast Agreement is concerned, again, I don't think many people who talk have actually read the detail, or at least they don't want to understand parts of it, because the very clear, I think one thing I hear over and over again is this idea that the Belfast Agreement said there could be no hard border at
That's right.
On the island of Ireland and at the frontier. And I keep using the word frontier because, you know, the Republic of Ireland, you know, everyone in Northern Ireland has to accept, whether they like it or not, the Republic of Ireland is a foreign country. It's an independent country. It's got its own currency. It's got its own, uses kilometers, not miles. It's got different corporation tax. It's got all of those things. So the idea that there's no border there, you know, is already, there is a frontier. What the Belfast Agreement was very clear about was that it had to get the removal of security installations at the border, the reduction, you know, of the role of the armed forces at the border, and all that aspect of it. There was nothing about economic trade borders. And I think Theresa May was hugely at fault when early on she talked about, oh, we couldn't even have any more cameras. We couldn't have cameras at the border. Well, any of us have gone up and down or driven up and down know there are cameras at the border, apart from anything else, for speed limits. But also, you know, I've been on a train from Dublin up to Belfast where the Gardaí have come on and checked people because of immigration controls. So the idea that there's never been any kind of controls is just such nonsense. But unfortunately, the Irish government are very, very clever at their whining and dining, in inverted commas, in Brussels. They have managed to win that argument with the EU about the Belfast Agreement, and then the EU very cleverly realised that this was a way to kind of punish the European Union and to make things quite awkward. To punish the United Kingdom and to make things awkward. But the Belfast Agreement, on terms of a border, that has got absolutely no mention. And in fact, the European Union is hardly mentioned in the Belfast Agreement. And yet you would think to listen to some of those in Brussels, that they had sort of created it and written it and been absolutely responsible. And then the other thing that I find very, very annoying is this idea that the Belfast Agreement was all about north-south. Well, it wasn't. It was equally about east-west, west-east relations between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And that, of course, is what has been completely destroyed in a way because of the way that the protocol is working economically. So there's no doubt about it, in my view, that the Belfast Agreement, and that's before we even go on to discuss, as we probably will, the whole question of consent. No one has been asked about did they want this protocol, and it's no good people who were against us leaving the EU saying, oh, well, we shouldn't have voted to leave the EU. That was not anything to do with the protocol as such. The protocol was brought in specifically for these reasons about the Belfast Agreement and about the hard border. And so as far as I'm concerned, and I know that Jim probably knows more about the actual judicial review, the legal arguments that went on there, but undoubtedly the Belfast Agreement has been broken. And it's really interesting that I find it particularly interesting that, the Alliance Party of all parties isn't actually speaking up for the Belfast Agreement, and all they tend to do is continue to go on about, a hard border on the island of Ireland. And let's not forget, those who say there should never be a border on the island of Ireland, well, apart from the frontier, which I've already mentioned, there is now a border on the island of Ireland because it's not actually out in the Irish Sea. It's at Larne and Belfast and all these other places. So, the language has been taken over and used by people, and we have to start getting that emphasis back so that we're getting the truth about the Belfast Agreement and the truth about the way the protocol is affecting it.
Just on the, and I think Kate made an excellent point there at the end. I noticed that Claire Hanna come off with this point in the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee when the Loyalist Communities Council was there, and I've no idea why she wasn't challenged on this whenever she tried to equate the protections in terms of consent for repealing the Act of Union with consent for leaving the European Union. I mean, that is just an entirely illogical and legally illiterate argument to make, and she should have been challenged on it, because Section 1 of the Northern Ireland Act deals with the internal constitutional issue of Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom. It doesn't deal with the United Kingdom's place within the European Union. So as long as Northern Ireland remains within the United Kingdom, whatever the United Kingdom vote to in regards to the European Union doesn't require the express consent of the people of Northern Ireland. And I mean, what Claire Hanna and other people trying to do is turn the protections within Section 1 inwards on themselves and say that, well, the people of Northern Ireland should have had consent to leave the European Union. And I mean, that's putting things back to front. In the first instance, if you want to make that argument, the people of Northern Ireland would have had to vote to leave the United Kingdom, because so long as the people of Northern Ireland are part of the United Kingdom, then if the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, then all of the United Kingdom leaves the European Union. So on that, this notion that the Belfast Agreement meant that there could be no land border is quite simply nonsense. Firstly, the Belfast Agreement has absolutely no effect whatsoever in domestic law. It's a national treaty through the British-Irish Agreement. It's a Northern Ireland Act that has effect in domestic law, and this point was led by nationalists in the High Court and the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, who all said that there's nothing in the Belfast Agreement which would prevent the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. But I'll tell you what the Belfast Agreement, if Section 1 does mean anything, does, is that it should prevent a fundamental change to the Act of Union. So this might not be a politically popular point, but here it is summed up. The Belfast Agreement and the Northern Ireland Act 1998, if you actually read it as it should be, does not prevent a land border, but it should prevent a sea border. And I mean, that may not be political, but that's the reality of it. It's been twisted and turned, and as Kate spoke about, we now have the spirit of the Belfast Agreement, and I wonder how these people summons this spirit up. I mean, do they get down on their knees with some holy smoke and consult with the spirit of the Belfast Agreement to say what it thinks? And I'm sure Jim will say a lot more about the constitutional parts of the Belfast Agreement, so I'll not intrude on that, but just a quick point in terms of the and again, I don't like the Belfast Agreement. It created a process to end the union, but nevertheless, let's take it at its height. One of the key pillars of it strand 1.5d of the Belfast Agreement is that key decisions have to be made on a cross-community basis. So the Belfast Agreement is based on this equilibrium that there's a veto to both communities, in a sense. Now, we heard all through the Brexit process that the Belfast Agreement had to be protected in all its parts. It's almost as if Moses came down with it written on tablets of stone. But then on the 9th of December 2020, the Secretary of State unilaterally, without the consent of a single unionist within Northern Ireland, laid secondary legislation in the form of a statutory instrument, which inserted section 56A and Schedule 6A to the Northern Ireland Act, which disapplied the cross-community consent mechanism in section 42 for the vote on the protocol. So, I mean, the Belfast Agreement has to be protected in all its parts, but when it comes to unilaterally changing the Northern Ireland Act to allow nationalists to be able to impose the protocol on unionists, I mean, there's no problem with unilaterally amending the Belfast Agreement or the Northern Ireland Act then, is there? So I think that flushes out that the Belfast Agreement is only ever a weapon for nationalism, and it offers no protection for unionism. And on that secondary legislation, it goes back to the same point in relation to the active union point, is that the Secretary of State has purported to amend a constitutional statute. And I mean, unless there's express power in enabling legislation, it's a very basic point to say that secondary legislation can't override that, and that's what they've purported to do. So I actually think that in all respects is unlawful. And just finally, to another nonsense point which has been made in relation to cross-community consent, is that apparently it doesn't apply to devolved matters. This is not a devolved matter, and I would just encourage people to go and have a look at section 42 of the 1998 Act. It lends itself to a decision coming before the Assembly, and it is in no way constrained by a devolved, that it has to be a devolved matter.
I mean, just to comment on that before I speak to Jim and Kate. I mean, I've got the protocol in front of me here, and just off the basis of what the panel members are saying, Article 1, objectives of the protocol. So this is the purpose, this is the goal of the protocol. It states that the protocol, without prejudice to the provisions of the 1998 agreement in respect of the constitutional status of Northern Ireland and the principle of consent. So it affirms that that the constitutional status can only be changed by the consent of the majority of the people, but by what's being told to me, the constitutional status, in many respects, the constitutional nature, has been changed already. And then paragraph 3 of the protocol states that the protocol sets out arrangements to protect the 1998 agreement in all of its dimensions. So in what way does the protocol protect the Belfast Agreement in all of its dimensions, Jim? And I don't think you're a fan of the Belfast Agreement, but
no, but you know, this whole deployment of the Belfast Agreement is the biggest con of the protocol advocates, because they say, oh, you can't have a border on the island of Ireland because of the Belfast Agreement. So not more than once in the Assembly, I have lifted up the Belfast Agreement and challenged any member to show me where in the Belfast Agreement it says there cannot be an economic border on the island of Ireland. To show me where it says that the United Kingdom as a whole cannot leave the EU. To show me where it says there cannot be regulatory checks on the island of Ireland. To show me where there can be the Northern Ireland can't be in a different single market. It says none of those things. And yet you would think that it says all of those things because of the lies and misrepresentation of those who present and promote the protocol, led by the EU themselves, who say we are doing all this to protect the Belfast Agreement. There is nothing within the Belfast Agreement that necessitates anything in the protocol. It is simply a ploy and a deceit to pretend otherwise. But what the Belfast Agreement does talk much about is consent. Consent is supposedly the underlying necessity of how Northern Ireland moves forward. And yet, with total disregard for that most fundamental element of consent, we have had put upon us a protocol which changes our constitutional position, which makes us subject to foreign laws and foreign courts, and none of that with any consent, and demonstrably without the consent of a single unionist representative. And yet suddenly that doesn't matter. It's quite clear that the Belfast Agreement has been used as a Trojan, as a deceit to try and pretend that the objectives of the protocol is to protect things that are in it which are not in it. And we got to the ridiculous situation where the Prime Minister of the day, Mrs. May, said she wouldn't even put a camera on the border. Yet we know when it suited the EU over the starving of the United Kingdom of vaccines, when they invoked Article 16, where were they going to put the vaccine border? Right where the border should be, as between the United Kingdom and the EU. So they have played fast and loose to incredible depths of dishonesty over the Belfast Agreement issues, and used it as a tool and as a con in respect of the gullible who have swallowed the stuff about the protocol.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. That was a good summary. So we've continuing on with our discussion here. We're going to move on to the role of the British government and the Irish government, in particular, the threat of violence, which I think needs talked about when it comes to the Northern Ireland Protocol. But thus far, we've learned that, or we've spoke about how the protocol is an economic catastrophe. It's a constitutional abomination. It puts us in a position where our sovereignty has been undermined, and it leaves the Belfast Agreement in tatters. So what about the use, and we've heard this a lot, what about the use of the threat of Republican violence? And this has been talked about particularly lately from within the Unionist and Loyalist community, probably for the last 2 years, but it was talked about plenty from a political choir within nationalism and within the EU. What role has the threat of Republican violence played in the creation of the Northern Ireland Protocol? Jamie, we'll maybe start with you on that.
Well, I mean, the Northern Ireland Protocol, and this is why I call it the violence rewarding protocol, is based on the fundamental premise that in order to protect peace, there can't be a land border, there must be a sea border. So if you just boil that down to its most logical and simple form, what that means is, well, if the premise is that the protocol is there to protect peace, that would mean if there was a border on the land rather than the sea, that peace would be endangered, and therefore that most logically and basically gives a veto to those who have threatened violence. And I mean, the threat of violence was given a seat at the top table in the negotiations. Of course, we had nationalists here in Northern Ireland. We had Claire Hanna, who spoke to Business Insider. I'll leave the swear words out of contribution, but he said that people wouldn't be expected to just choke it down, and that you would expect civil disobedience at a minimum. I mean, so that's Claire Hanna, who now purports to lecture everybody else. The Alliance said something similar. Sinn Féin were in fancy dress at the border with sledgehammers. And I mean, Sinn Féin would know all about jumping back and forward over the border, as they spent 30 years murdering Protestants and running to the Irish Republic for sanctuary. They weren't too bothered about the border then when it died away in the Irish Republic. And then, of course, we had the Prime Minister of the Irish Republic, who went to the European Union and who basically, he exhibited as evidence the threat of annihilating bombs at the table. And that played a massive role, and that's why we are where we are now. So we have this incredibly difficult situation, this powder keg precedent, where the message has been sent that the threat of violence is a way to gain political leverage. And I mean, and I don't condone this line of thinking, but there's many young loyalists, and it's difficult to argue against this logically, who say, well, hold on a minute. The threat of violence was good enough to prevent a land border. Why is the threat of violence not going to be good enough to remove a sea border? And I mean, how do you actually logically argue against the precedent which has been set? But ultimately, all the protocol did was follow the basic trajectory of the Belfast Agreement, which is based on the very fundamental that nationalists must be constantly provided concessions in order to maintain the peace. The price of peace is perpetual nationalist concessions as part of a process leading to a united Ireland. So, I mean, nobody should be surprised that the protocol ordered the threat of nationalist violence, because for 23 years, our whole political system is based on the premise that nationalists must get nationalists want, or they may be at the peace. And that is why, and Kate touched on it earlier, and I coined this a couple of years ago, we have this insane situation where peace and the process are joined together to have this morally, this phrase to blackmail people to say, well, you must support the process, which is the Belfast Agreement, or you must be anti-peace. So if you want to have peace, you have to have the process. I mean, what an absurd situation. You must support a particular political policy or agreement, or else peace might be at danger. And I mean, this is thrown up and exposed all of the fundamental flaws, both morally, politically, and legally, with the Belfast Agreement. And as I say, the protocol only follows the whole premise of the peace process, which is nationalist threats of violence get rewarded again and again.
And Kate, do you want to have you anything to add to that? Or?
Well, not an awful lot. I mean, I agree with everyone who thinks that basically violence, the threat of violence, I mean, when it comes from someone like the Taoiseach, and he takes that picture of the customs post and holds it up and says, look, I mean, he doesn't even need to say, I'm saying that there is a threat of violence. And of course, that's how some people try to say that, he didn't actually say it, but he took that because he knew that that was what he wanted the European Union commissioners and, people to pick up on. And the saddest thing, of course, is that our government, and I really, just another little thing, I hate us referring always to the British government. That's what Sinn Féin like to do. We should be talking about our government, and our UK government, I'm afraid, let us down really badly on all sorts of things. But on that issue of violence, they played along with that, particularly Theresa May. And I mean, I remember being in a meeting with her over the backstop and talking about, and genuinely, I mean, you just felt that she genuinely thought that the Belfast Agreement was absolutely sacrosanct, and that if anything changed to upset the status quo in terms of the border, then there would be violence. And there's no doubt about it that influenced an awful lot of people. And I feel particularly, at the moment where we're seeing these protests all over Northern Ireland and people peacefully protesting about the protocol, let's be honest, they don't get publicity. The Northern Ireland media doesn't cover it, and the national media certainly doesn't, unless there is violence. Now, that's not to say that I want to see violence, but I just think that there is a responsibility of our media in Northern Ireland to actually stop being so kind of one-sided about issues and how they present them. And I'm afraid that brings in the role of, the PSNI. I've been horrified since I've been home an awful lot more to see just how one-sided, genuinely one-sided it seems that the PSNI operates. It's almost as if they're frightened of anything to do with Republican demonstrations or Republican, I'm not just talking about the Story funeral, just generally speaking, we mustn't upset Sinn Féin. And, I find that is no way to run a democracy, and it's no way to get a long-term stability in Northern Ireland. So I think we have to continually push that, to say to our government that they are being misled completely by the whole idea of the violence question, and that all they're doing is building up huge resentment amongst particularly young people in our areas, pro-union areas in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people realise the damage that has done to particularly within the Loyalist community, that sort of messaging has reaped rewards. I think people are still unaware of that. But just to come to you on that, Jim, some people would make the argument that, people like Leo Varadkar and the Irish Taoiseach and others were just simply doing what the police did, the security services did, and just restating a security assessment or whatever. And I mean, I think there is a difference between objectively analysing a security assessment and using that assessment for political gain. But what do you make of that sort of argument that people would lobby that you're just rehashing what the police already said?
I don't buy that at all. Let's be very clear. the threat of violence was the midwife of the protocol. That's what delivered it. That's what drove the border from where it should be at the international frontier to the Irish Sea, the threat of violence. And why was there a threat of violence? Well, I believe because republicanism realized that if there was a proper Brexit in which Northern Ireland left the EU with the rest of the United Kingdom, and Brexit was successful, and we made our way as an independent nation with world trade deals, that prosperity would flow from Brexit, that Northern Ireland would prosper, and that that would upset the entire All Ireland apple cart. So I think they feared Brexit because of the fact that it would make an All Ireland even less likely to ever happen. And therefore they used the threat of violence to derail Brexit for Northern Ireland, to deny us Brexit, and to force partition of the United Kingdom. And in doing that, of course, they have made a tremendous stride forward towards the All Ireland that they seek. It's now the United Kingdom that is partitioned, courtesy of the protocol. And I think it was the realization that a proper Brexit would have meant greater prosperity and success and further divergence from the rest of Ireland by Northern Ireland within the UK that drove the mentality of threatening violence, and then the misuse and the misrepresentation of what the Belfast Agreement said and didn't say on all those issues. It was a carefully choreographed strategy in which one of the lead actors was Varadkar with his prop of the photograph of the bombing, a bombing of terrorism. And by holding up that photograph, Varadkar was sending a very subliminal and more message that violence would come if Northern Ireland was allowed to leave the EU and make its own way along with the rest of the United Kingdom. An absolutely appalling stance for anyone who would try to lecture the rest of us sometimes about good conduct and politics and consent and everything else. When the push came to shove, he was in there behind the threat of violence to push the border to where it never should have been.
Just on back a point Kate made about how the media and some of the politicians have ignored the peaceful protests. I mean, the government ignored loyalist warnings and loyalists trying to do things properly for many years, and arguing against this protocol while its nationalism was threatening violence. And there's an appalling situation within the United Kingdom where the threat of violence appears to be rewarded. And I mean, this is a very sad point that I have to make. And of course, I don't in any way condone this, but I mean, it's a very sad reality that there was many people on the streets peacefully protesting, and nobody wanted to listen to the Unionist and Loyalist community. And one bus was burnt on Lanark Way, and all of a sudden the President of the United States, the Prime Minister, and everybody else all of a sudden wanted to listen to Loyalists. I mean, what kind of message does that send? So I think in order to counter that, what the government and other public bodies need to do is they need to listen very carefully to the Unionist and Loyalist community, and to listen to the Unionist and Loyalist community 365 days a year, not only whenever there's an act of violence. And I mean, this all goes back to the very, very dangerous precedent which has been sent when you set the message, the contemptible, the disgraceful message that the threat of violence or actual violence is the way to gain political concessions. Of course, that's what the Belfast Agreement is based on. But I mean, if we're going to move away from that and we're genuinely going to have peace, then we have to get away from the reality that violence is rewarded. And if we want to counter that, and we want to diffuse that powder keg precedent which has been set by the violence rewarding protocol, then the only way to do that is the complete eradication of this protocol, which is a constitutional abomination. It is politically immoral, awful, and it is an absolute disgrace that any British Parliament, this is a moral stain on the British Parliament. It's even worse than the Belfast Agreement, and I mean, it's hard pushed to get worse than the Belfast Agreement in terms of a moral stain, but I mean, the British Parliament has outdone themselves this time, along with Boris Johnson and his merry band of men in the Cabinet Office who have decided to partition the United Kingdom as a reward for nationalist threats of violence.
Okay, so thank you for that. We've spoke about so many of the problems with the protocol, and I think each of you have given fantastic insight into that. We want to talk briefly here about solutions, alternatives, ways forward, because I know there'll be a lot of people who are listening to this right now who are nodding their heads and shaking their fists saying this protocol is a disgrace, this protocol must go, but they'll also be asking what can actually be done to solve this. What can be done to right this wrong and to rid ourselves of this abomination, as Jamie called it. So, Jim, if I maybe start with yourself,
Yep.
What can be done? What can political unionism do? What can the business people do? What can we do? What can be done to rid ourselves of the protocol?
Well, maybe in a way the most important question of the night. Let me start by saying what isn't the answer. Extended grace periods, mitigations, rubbing down the barnacles, as the Prime Minister said, are not the answer, because that still leaves you with the fundamental obscenity of the protocol, that we would still be in a foreign single market for goods, a foreign customs code, a foreign VAT regime, subject to foreign laws, overseen by a foreign court. That is the crux of the matter. And unless and until that is addressed, then the protocol is not addressed. Now, how do we get rid of it? Well, I think the judicial review is a very important part of that, because if we could demonstrate through the Supreme Court, and it will ultimately go to the Supreme Court, that the protocol is unlawful, then in fact, we give the British government the leverage they need to go back to Brussels and say, sorry, this won't fly because even our courts have turned it down. But I can't guarantee the judicial review will succeed. But if it did, it would be the end of the protocol. Second thing to say is that the protocol needs to be defeated politically. Now, we will never defeat the protocol by implementing it. Peter Robinson, 2 months ago, in a very perceptive article in the newsletter, was absolutely right. You cannot proclaim that you're opposed to the protocol while at the same time implementing it. And that is a message that Edwin Poots needs to get, because it is Edwin Poots, as Agriculture Minister, who has built the Poots posts on the border. It was Edwin Poots' department who are implementing and staffing the border. If unionists are serious about this, if we're not just play acting, if we're not just deploying words, if we're serious about this, then we need to cease implementing the protocol and bring it to a head politically. JR will bring it to a head legally, but it needs to be brought to a head politically. And the Prime Minister needs to be brought to a point of choice. Does he want to save the protocol, or does he want to save political stability in Northern Ireland? Because he should not be able to have both. And that has to be the abiding message. Because let's be very clear, if we do not kill the protocol will kill the union. That's how serious it is. It is the most serious threat to the union in my lifetime. And I suggest in the lifetime of anyone listening to this broadcast tonight. So we need to get serious about it. And of course, the importance of concerted political action is that it fills the vacuum that no one else can then fill with less desirable means. If politicians fail to take this issue on, if they fail to recognize the constitutional imperative of defeating the protocol, then yes, others will, with the encouragement that they've seen of violence working for other people fill that vacuum. That's not where we need to go. But the best antidote to that is concerted, determined, unwilting political action to demonstrate that with this protocol, we will not put. And, you know, that has to be the mentality of unionism. And if that becomes the mentality and the action of unionism, then this protocol cannot survive. It cannot survive if it is not implemented. What would Brussels think when they look across and ask themselves the question, who's implementing the protocol? The people who say they don't like it. And then we're seriously thinking that we're going to persuade Brussels and London to have a rethink. Our actions have to match our words. And if we don't, this protocol will undo us. And let's get rid of the notion that all we have to do is wait to 2024 and we can vote it out. No, we can't. We can vote Articles 5 to 10 down, and then there's 2 years to find a replacement for them. We cannot vote down the rest of the protocol, and we can only do it with a majority in the Assembly. So, and by 2024, I tell you, it will be bedded in, and if it's bedded in, it will not be removed. So now is the time for concerted political action to unstitch and unsettle and thereby remove the protocol. And that is a bounden duty on everyone who is unionist in terms of a representative and who have any role or part to play in defeating that which is going to snuff out the union if we don't.
Jamie, go ahead.
Yeah, well, if
Go ahead,
sorry,
Kate.
if we I mean, if we want to be kind to the EU, we could say yes, they do need to protect their internal market. But that is their responsibility. And the reality is we all know, and most people who have looked at this, there are alternatives. There doesn't need to be a protocol that changes the constitutional position of Northern Ireland. There could have been something called mutual enforcement, where both governments, the EU and the British government, actually agreed, you know, that there was no need for a physical border and that they would take responsibility to make sure that goods were not going to go on into the EU. I mean, the tiny amount that is actually a risk is so little. So that, you know, when you look at all the economic reasons why there's a protocol, it's clear that there are alternatives and they could have been made to work if there'd been goodwill and if the EU and the Irish government, or the Irish government working with the EU, had wanted it to happen. So I have no problem saying that, you know, I'm quite happy to allow the EU to protect the single market, but it doesn't need to do it through the protocol. I think it was a message came up there from someone who said, you know, if there'd been a land border, some kind of economic border at the frontier, would Sinn Féin have actually, and if they'd been the minister, would they have gone ahead and you know, made it work? And I don't think they would. And I do think that it's such a little thing in a way, although a major thing would be it would be portrayed as, but to actually say, I'm sorry, we're not going to do these checks. We're just not going to do them. We're not going to allow people not to be able to get things coming into Northern Ireland. We are not going to do it. If you want these done, then you will have to do them in your own country. And I feel very, very strongly about that. And I don't think that is in any way, you know, being kind of particularly radical. It's just so obvious. If we're against the protocol, then those who are able to make it work should not be making it work. And I also support, you know, I mean, I have to say, I think the current Taoiseach is an awful lot better than Varadkar. And I think he probably, because he's kind of lived through the troubles and he understands it a bit more perhaps than Varadkar too, I think he maybe, if he was allowed to, would actually go along with a lot of this, because long term this is not going to help the Republic of Ireland either. So I do think that we might have to consider, we should be considering why should we be meeting with the Irish government on these cross-border things when actually the crucial nature of the East-West relationship has been completely destroyed? What is the point? I mean, I think Edwin Putz is down there tonight. Now, it would be interesting to see what comes out of that, but I expect there'll be very, very little, but a few perhaps warm words. So I think those are the basic things that the Northern Ireland executive could do, which would be to say, we're not implementing it. We'll let the checks. We're sorry. We don't think there's any real danger here to your internal market. But if you do, then you do the checking when it gets over the border. And also, there's no point meeting the Irish government to talk about this until the Irish government accepts in the principle that the protocol is not going to continue and that we need to find an alternative. Very simple.
Jamie, I just want you to come in on that very briefly for me, because there's a couple of, we'd said about a Q&A at the end, and I know we're over time already, and I want to get a couple of questions in from the public. So if you could just give us a quick summary, what do you think are the solutions here?
Well, firstly, when we're talking about solutions, let's go back to basics. And so the most basic default position we start from is that if there has to be checks in the border should be where it belongs, between two sovereign territories. So we need to start from that default position and work our way backwards. And I mean, if we can get to a situation where there doesn't have to be checks anywhere, all well and good. But I mean, if we have to have checks on the land border, then so be it. I'm not going to cry any tears in relation to that. And I think, just to amplify quickly something that both Kate and Jim articulated very well, is that the opposite of the protocol, political instability. I mean, it's literally set out in Article 16, political and societal instability. So it's very basic and simple, and why some people in the DUP can't understand this is beyond me, is that if you want to damage the protocol, then you have to cause maximum political and societal instability. And having stable working institutions, stable north-south relations is the opposite of political instability. So if you're genuine and you actually want to get rid of the protocol, then you must cause maximum political instability. And I mean, that means, if necessary, pulling down the institutions. And I can't understand why unionism has some kind of sacred, or well, some parts of unionism, I'm sure me and Jim most definitely don't, but some others within unionism has some absolutely, it's almost like Stockholm syndrome in relation to the institutions and the Belfast Agreement. I mean, the message has to be very simple in one sentence. You can have your precious Belfast Agreement, or you can have the protocol, but you can't have both. And so long as the protocol remains, and so long as it operates within the sphere of political and societal stability, then Jim is quite right. It will become embedded, and the only way to light a fire underneath the protocol and get rid of it is to cause maximum political and societal instability. And unionism collectively, via robust and strong political action, genuine political action from political unionism, to cause maximum political instability, and grassroots unionism and loyalism united to peacefully engage in potentially civil disobedience or peaceful protest, and I emphasize peaceful, can cause maximum societal instability. And those two things working in tandem will upset the protocol and make it entirely unworkable. But until unionism accepts that basic reality, I mean, we're just going to go down in circles.
Okay, thank you, Jimmy. Okay, we're going to move on to a short Q&A, and I know we've already went over our time, so thank you, panelists, for staying on that, turning the lights off. But the first question is for you, Jim. It's regarding the judicial review. It's from Aaron Stewart, and he has asked, the judicial review proceedings into the Northern Ireland Protocol have now started. How likely, in your opinion, is it that they will succeed in removing the protocol? When will we find out whether that will succeed? And if it doesn't succeed, where does unionism go after that?
Well, the hearing of the protocol at the first stage, that's to say in the Belfast High Court, has been completed. The judge has reserved his judgment. I suspect that judgment will not be delivered until about September. I think whoever wins in the Belfast court, I have no doubt this matter will be appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. The steps are these. Normally, after the High Court, you go to the Court of Appeal in Northern Ireland, and from there you go to the Supreme Court in London. But there is a facility, if both sides are agreed, and certainly this would be our preference, that you can leapfrog over the Court of Appeal and go directly to the Supreme Court if they agree to hear it. and I would like that to happen because that would speed the process. And that means you could be at the Supreme Court by the end of this year or sometime thereafter. Now, I believe it's in the Supreme Court that the constitutional arguments will really be addressed. And I think our case is strong. I think it ran very well in Belfast. I think the government's arguments were weak in many regards. So if you took this, all the legal arguments and put them into like a legal computer and see what the result was, it should be a win. But of course, we have to understand that you're subject to all the political pressures probably that are on judges. The fact that governments have interests in making sure that that which is done is not unstitched, etc. Although if this government had any wit, they would see that the way to solve this issue is to see a victory against the protocol in the courts, and then they would have the leverage with Brussels. So I'm confident that we have a good case. It's been well prepared, well argued. Can I guarantee a positive outcome? Of course I can't. No case is so good it can't be lost, and this case could be lost, but I'm not anticipating defeat, but I am anticipating having to go all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, if ultimately it doesn't succeed, that's why I said earlier, we shouldn't have all our eggs in this basket. That's why we need to have the concerted political action in tandem to bring this a protocol to a grinding halt. And Kate made an important point when she said that we shouldn't, therefore, as part of our protest, be working the north-south bodies. You know, it's madness. Here's the east-west being absolutely trashed in terms of a border put down the Irish Sea, and Unionists tell us that they're still going to operate the north-south bodies. You know, where's the leverage? Why would we do that? If we're serious about destabilizing the protocol and getting rid of it, then we need to use the political muscle, and that aspect of it has to be very much stepped up if we are to succeed. So the solution is the twin-track approach of the legal challenge and strong, relentless political action to demonstrate that this protocol will not work. Only then will any government remove it.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here. This is going to go to everyone, but Kate, I'm gonna start with you. This is from Michael from East Belfast. Who, in your mind, is responsible for the Northern Ireland Protocol? And like I said, I'm gonna give Jamie and Jim an opportunity to come in there as well after you. Who do you think's responsible for it?
Well, first of all, can I just say very quickly on the judicial review, we've had a brilliant QC in John Larkin. He's done an absolutely wonderful job. And I also wanted to mention Ben Habib, who's the Brexit MEP from London, who took an interest in Northern Ireland and had realised just what this is doing, and who worked with me, myself and Jim Allister, and then managed to get all of the Unionist parties to come on board. So that was a little bit of a, I think that was good to get all the parties united. But they've done a brilliant job, particularly Ben and John Larkin. Who is responsible? Well, I'm not sure there's anyone particularly I'm not going to get into sort of blaming anyone particularly in Northern Ireland for the protocol. I think there was some perhaps naivety around, but the reality is it was the person I hold most responsible initially was Theresa May. I think she was a weak prime minister, and she didn't, she wasn't a Brexiteer to start with. She took on as prime minister, became prime minister, and I think she was given the benefit of the doubt for quite a while until it began to see that she really was wanting us to stay in as much as possible, both in this single market and the customs union. And she is responsible, I think, more than anyone for getting that original agreement, agreeing to that that actually led to, you know, the backstop and then the whole question. I think if she'd been tough from the beginning, but you know, it's always easy in hindsight looking back on things. You know, I don't blame, and I'm sure I'll make myself very unpopular here, but I don't really blame Boris totally, in the sense that, you know, I can't explain enough really how serious the position was in the House of Commons before there was a majority, a Conservative majority. There was that finely balanced House of Commons, who most Labour MPs, a substantial number of senior Conservatives, were doing everything they could to stop Brexit. They wanted to stop it, they wanted to delay it, then they wanted to stop it. And there was a real danger that we could have lost the whole thing again. I mean, they were pushing for another referendum, the people's vote, all of that. And I think when it came to that general election, and you know, as he was Prime Minister then, he took a big gamble, really. He went for a general election when he didn't need to, as the way of getting Brexit delivered. And I think then it almost was too late to stop the kind of protocol in you know, even, and I mean, the DUP did vote against it. There were, you know, I didn't support it. There were, you know, a lot of people didn't support it. But fundamentally, if you were a strong Brexiteer and you had just been elected to a party that had said, we're going to get Brexit done, then it was going to go through. But, you know, I really would say that we have still got friends in the House of Commons. They may have been being very quiet at the moment because there's, you know, there's lots of maneuvers and things going on behind the scenes. But fundamentally, I would, if I had to name one person, you know, in a senior position, it would be Theresa May.
Okay, I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that really quickly.
No,
Just quickly, I'll just deal with this in two parts. Firstly, I call it the violence rewarding protocol. So who is initially responsible for creating this situation? Naturally, follow the logic of that, it's those who threaten violence. But I mean, those who knocked the door are the ones who threatened violence. They banged on the door. But I mean, he's ultimately responsible for those who opened the door and let them in. And that is every single member of Parliament that put their hand up and voted for the protocol, because it's a betrayal of Northern Ireland, and people have to take responsibility for that. And I think Margaret Thatcher delivered the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and in any written works I've read about Mrs. Thatcher, in her latter years, it was her greatest political regret that she agreed the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And I think for everyone, especially Conservative and Unionist MPs who voted to deliver this betrayal of Northern Ireland and partitioning the United Kingdom, I think that they will look back on their political careers and many, many years from now, as they come into the twilight years of their lives, I think they will look back and see that they betrayed the United Kingdom and betrayed the proud institution of the British Parliament. And if they want to correct that historical wrong which they have inflicted upon the people of our country, upon their fellow Unionists and British citizens, and they need to do everything that they possibly can to fix the mistake that they made. They let the violent boarding protocol in the door. It's up to them to grab it by the scruff of the neck and kick it back out onto the street again where it belongs.
If we could just very quickly say, slightly disagree with Kate. I think you cannot but blame the man who signed it, and that was Boris. He's not the sole accused in this, but I think there's a pretty strong indictment against him in that regard. Look, there were strategic mistakes made, yes, even by Unionism. You know, Unionism through the DUP after the 2017 election had untold power over the government, in that there couldn't have been a government without them. And yet the focus seemed to be more on getting money than getting it written in blood, as it were, that the United Kingdom would leave as one nation. And I think the whole business of special treatment of Northern Ireland can be traced right back to the folly of a letter in August 2016, just 2 months after the referendum, when Martin McGuinness and Arlene Foster jointly wrote to the British government saying we need all sorts of special provisions. That started the ball rolling on special status and it ultimately led to the protocol, aided on the way very much by far greater pressures and threats of violence and everything else. But I don't think there's a single component part that can be blamed. But I think there were strategic mistakes made, and notional agreements to regulatory borders back in October 19 was another mistake, because once Boris got that, he then whipped away the consent mechanism, which would have been the comfort blanket for it. So I think, but we are where we are. The critical challenge now is to determine to unstitch it and undo it, not in a half-hearted way, but wholeheartedly.
I agree with Jim. I mean, I think that's the crucial thing now for unionism and pro-union community and people who just hate the protocol is, what do we do and how do we get everyone who feels like that to work together and not, there's no point now, I think, looking back and constantly blaming people, other than obviously the government as such, but how do we go forward? How can we get people in Northern Ireland, particularly in communities where they're feeling angry and betrayed and fed up? How do we get them to be doing positive things to change this?
That leads us quite neatly on to my last question, and that's from Jim from the North Coast Loyalist Coalition. Obviously, I'll start with Jamie and then move around the group. Obviously, there is a number of protests that are taking place right now throughout Northern Ireland sporadically and happening throughout the country. The question is, what role, if any, can these protests play in helping remove the Northern Ireland Protocol? And is there a stage in which civil disobedience is justified? So that's from Jim from the North Coast Loyalist Coalition. Jamie, we'll start with you. Oh, you're on mute. I can't hear you. That Danica D Wi-Fi.
Sorry about that. In regards to could there come a point when civil disobedience is justified? In a word, yes. And what role does the protest have? Well, I think I already identified earlier that creating political stability and societal instability has to go hand in hand. So the protest can create maximum, peacefully of course, can create maximum societal instability, and I mean there's all sorts of ways to do that peacefully, and that's of course what we want to see. So the protests need to work in tandem with political action, but political action also needs to work in tandem with protest action in terms of creating maximum societal instability. So in a short answer, political and societal instability have to go hand in hand. Grassroots unionism and loyalism in our gift to create maximum societal instability, and it's within elected political unionism's gift to create maximum political instability. And I think if both sides put their shoulder to the wheel and show a genuine commitment to that, then I think political and societal instability going hand in hand can create the situation where the protocol is entirely unworkable.
Yeah.
Okay, Jim.
Yeah, well, I think a peaceful protest is important. It is a part to play. I've spoken at the one in Bryson, and I think I'm due to speak to another one shortly. And they do need to be encouraged in a peaceful way. And I think it's important that the public express themselves. On the question of civil disobedience, I have to say, I would not ask any citizen to engage in civil disobedience if unionist politicians are still implementing the protocol. Why should the ordinary man in the street take risks about situations like that if unionist ministers are continuing to implement the very thing they're protesting about? So I think the primary burden is on the politicians to lead, and only then, when they have done all that can be done, could they justifiably say to the wider community, now we need you to engage in civil disobedience. I think a bit of civil disobedience up at Stormont would be the right place to start it.
Well, I mean, I think that having been 30 years as a member of Parliament, I understand the process of lobbying and hassling your MLA and your MP, and I know that's difficult in certain areas, but I do think that, Jim's right about that. It's important that the MLAs know the feeling of the people who are out protesting, and that they get that directly. And they get that at their constituency surgeries, and they get that through all sorts of methods that people lobby. They need to know that if they're going to continue to implement the protocol, then they're not going to get, their support. And similarly, I think with members of the DUP and members of the Unionist Party, and indeed members of the TUV, so I'm being equal-handed, also need to be lobbying within their own parties, because clearly a lot of members, from what I've picked up, of the mainstream Unionist parties have not felt that they've been listened to, and not felt that they've had any real say in the policies of the day-to-day policies of what's been happening on the protocol. So I think peaceful protests with music and fun, and making it not, I hate the feeling of people marching through with covered up, although we all cover up at the moment, COVID, but it's got to be welcoming to people. It's got to make the average person who would never think of going on a demonstration feel that this is something they could come out and at least stand the side of the road and support. So I'm quite in favour of all of that, but I do think Jim's point's quite right. The politicians have to be put on the spot in order to make them do what they can do as politicians, and then that coinciding with all the other, the judicial review and all the other aspects might help to move things on.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. That was absolutely brilliant. Can I just thank each of you on behalf of Let's Talk Loyalism for attending this evening and your contributions. I know I've significantly benefited from it. I think it was very informative, very insightful, and thank you on behalf of Let's Talk Loyalism for attending, each of you. It was a fantastic discussion this evening, where we've heard Jim Allister, Jamie Bryson and Kate Hoey break down some of the problems with the Northern Ireland Protocol, and we hope that you have enjoyed it, for those who have been watching from home. But like previously, what we said at the start of the broadcast, we are hosting another live stream event on Monday, the 14th of June, called Alternatives to the Protocol, in which we will have some high-profile politicians on that as well. So thank you, everyone who's tuned in to watch this evening, whether it be in Let's Talk Loyalism's Facebook page, our YouTube channel, or our Twitter account. Thank you.
Thanks for
Thank
the
you very
opportunity.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you for organising.
Thank you.